Good day, everyone. Today, our topic is second language acquisition. So, we will talk about L1 or first language, L2 or second language, multilingualism, formal L2 learning, informal L2 learning, and many more. So, first, we'll have to differentiate L1 from L2. So, what do we mean when we say first language or L1? Like every individual, since their very young age, they have learned at least one language, and we call that as the first language. And the language that is learned after that first language is what we call second language. So, how is first language different from second language? Usually, if we say first language, this is learned without much effort or without much thinking about it, while learning the second language needs some effort in learning it. We will talk more on acquiring the second language as we go on with the discussion in this second language acquisition. Second language acquisition, or SLA, refers both to the study of individuals and groups who are learning a language subsequent to learning their first one as young children, and to the process of learning that language. The additional language is called second language or L2, even if there are other languages that you learned after the first language, like there is third language, fourth or fifth, 10th language that you acquire, you still call that second language. There's no such thing as third language, fourth language, and so on and so forth. Only second language, no matter how many languages you acquire after your first language, still they are called second language. It is also commonly called as target language or TL, which refers to any language that is the aim or goal of learning. Now, the scope of this discussion is informal L2 learning, which takes place in naturalistic contexts, and which I will be explaining later, and formal L2 learning that takes place in classrooms. And there's also the combination of the two, L2 learning that involves a mixture of these settings and circumstances. Okay, let me give you an example. Informal L2 learning first. So a Filipino child goes to the US and studies there. He naturally talks to native speakers and picks up their language, and then eventually talks their language, and that becomes his second language. So that is informal L2 learning. How about formal L2 learning? For example, a Filipino student goes to a Korean language school because he is going to Korea, or he's going to work there or study there. So he goes to school to study the language. So that is formal second language learning. Now, a mixture of these two is a person wants to go to Korea, he has to enroll Korean class to learn how to speak the language, and then goes outside in the market with her or his friends. He talks in that target language, Korean language, that is a mixture of formal and informal second language learning. So he goes to school, studies the language, but goes out and in his environment, he also uses that language in talking to other people. That's a mixture of formal and informal second language learning. So I repeat, informal L2 learning takes place in naturalistic contexts. Formal L2 learning takes place in classrooms, and L2 learning involves a mixture of these settings and circumstances that is a mixture of informal and formal L2 learning. Now let's talk more about what is a second language. A second language is typically an official or societally dominant language needed for education, employment, and other basic purposes. It is often acquired by minority group members of immigrants who speak another language natively. How about a foreign language? A foreign language is one not widely used in the learner's immediate social context, which might be used for future travels or other cross-cultural communication situations, or studied as a curricular requirement or elective in school, but with no immediate or necessary practical application. Just like, for example, in senior high school, there's also already an elective which is foreign language. So the students can choose whether they will study Korean, French, Chinese, or whatever is offered in their particular school. Also, in doctorate programs, they offer foreign language subjects. Next, a library language is one which functions primarily as a tool for further learning through reading, especially when books or journals in the desired field of study are not commonly published in the learner's native tongue. Okay, and an auxiliary language is one which learners need to know for some official functions in their immediate political setting or will need for purpose of wider communication, although their first language serves most other needs in their lives. Usually when we say auxiliary language, this happens when two persons speak entirely different languages and they need a language, a common one, which will make them understand each other. So that's auxiliary language. Okay, now what is first language? So we have the terms first language, native language, primary language, and mother tongue. Most of the time, these terms are used interchangeably, or some linguists also believe that these terms are actually synonymous to one another because there's no clear-cut differences among these terms. So remember, first language, native language, primary language, mother tongue. We will meet these terms as we go on with the lessons under SLA, or second language acquisition. Acquisition of more than one language during early childhood is called simultaneous multilingualism. I repeat, it's simultaneous multilingualism when the acquisition happens during the early childhood. Sequential multilingualism is learning additional languages after L1 has already been established. So we'll talk more on that as we go on. Multilingualism refers to the ability to use two or more languages. Some linguists and psychologists use bilingualism for the ability to use two languages and multilingualism for more than two. But for the purpose of studying acquisition in this subject, second language acquisition, we will have to make use of multilingualism. Okay, monolingualism refers to the ability to use only one language. Okay, let's see. How about you? How many languages can you speak? As for me, I can speak Filipino, but my native tongue is actually Ilocano or Iloco. I can speak Filipino. I can speak English, and formally I learned the Mandarin, but if you ask me to speak in Mandarin, especially when talking to a native speaker of Mandarin, maybe I will not be able to communicate properly because I took that as a formal L2 learning. However, I was not able to make use of that in practical applications. So I somehow have forgotten those things that I have learned in my foreign language. And that happens, especially if there's no practice. Okay, now the nature of language learning. Take note that even before you went to school, even before you attended your formal schooling, you have already established your first language. and you have already completed this, what we call development of this language. And this happens without much conscious effort. It just so happened that you learned to talk. This was the language that you heard, and this was the language that was used by your parents and the people around you. And then you naturally had that or acquired that as your first language. If we go back to some of the lessons in developmental psychology, you will recall that at the age of 6 months, an infant can already produce vowel sounds, and they usually imitate what the parents are speaking or saying. And so naturally, children will be able to recognize that a certain sound or a certain word is different from the language they are using when they hear people using other languages. So let's talk about the role of natural ability. Humans are born with the natural ability or innate capacity to learn language. Okay, what is this innate capacity or natural ability? In viewing the natural ability to acquire language in terms of innate capacity, we're saying that part of language structure is genetically given to every human child. So this tells us that every child, when he or she is born into this world, he already has this innate capacity to learn the language because it has already been given to every human child. Now, since all languages are incredibly complex system, which no children could possibly master in their early years, to the degree they succeed in doing so if they had to learn them in the usual sense of that word. Children's ability to create new utterances is remarkable, and their ability to recognize when a string of common words does not constitute a grammatical sentence in the language is even more. So, for example, let me give you an example here. The child naturally learns as he uses the language that it is not proper to say, apple, me, give. So the child will be able to sense that, oh, this order of words in my sentence does not make sense. So I think it has to be stated properly by saying, give me an apple instead of give apple me an. So you see, the structure of their sentences is naturally learned by the child as he uses the language. A hypothesis which many linguists and psychologists support is that a great many of these abstract principles are common to all language as opposed to the principles that are language specific, example specific to particular language. According to this view, those principles that are universal are programmed into all human children just by virtue of their being human. And this accounts for children's ability to process the smorgasbord of sounds and words that they hear, and their ability to come up with essentially the same structure as other children. Given the complexity of language, it is no wonder that even adults with their mature intellect seldom attain native fluency in a new language. Okay, if there is a study on native likeness in second language acquisition in the latter parts of this subject on the principles of second language acquisition, and you will find out how non-native speakers excel in attaining the native likeness whenever they are speaking or talking in conversations and in instructional manners. So to continue, almost all children with their limited memories, restricted reasoning powers, and immature analytical abilities acquire perfect fluency in their language to which they are adequately exposed and in which they interact with others. So that's what I was telling a while back. So even if you learn a second language, if you are not practicing it, it's like you are not using it in practical occasions, then it is difficult to attain fluency or even mastery in using that language. Now, how about the role of social experience? Not all of first language acquisition can be attributed to innate ability. For language-specific learning also plays a crucial role. Even if the universal properties of languages are programmed in children, they must learn all those features which distinguish their L1 from all other possible human languages. Children will never acquire such language-specific knowledge unless that language is used with them and around them. And they will learn to use only the language or languages used around them, no matter what their linguistic heritage. So let me give you an example. A child who is born in the Philippines with a Filipino mother and an American father. Okay, so if we talk about linguistic heritage, then you will understand that since the father is American, so he has an English speaking father. So that makes his linguistic heritage to be English, American English. However, he was born in the Philippines with a Filipino mother, and then he is exposed to people who are talking Filipino. And so the result is the child will now speak the Filipino language, and that becomes his native tongue. Now, is it possible that since the father of this child is American, so is it natural that he also knows that specific language even without teaching him or her? That would be difficult. Why? Because the people around him or her do not talk to him or her in that language. So for that child, learning his ancestral language is as difficult as just learning any other foreign language. Now let's have L1 versus L2 learning. Okay, we have three states: the initial state, the intermediate states, and the final state. Okay, so that's it. So as I explained, just look at the table that is shown there. Okay, those are the three phases. We have the initial, intermediate, and the final state. The initial state. While the initial state in children's minds for L1 almost surely is an innate capacity to learn language, it is not all certain whether or not such natural ability is part of the initial state in older learners for second language acquisition. Some linguists and psychologists believe that the genetic predisposition which children have from birth to learn language remains with them throughout life, and that differences in the final outcomes of L1 and L2 learning are attributable to other factors. Others believe that some aspects of the innate capacity which children have for L1 remain in force for acquisition of subsequent languages, but that some aspects in this natural ability are lost with advancing stage. Still others believe that no innate capacity for language acquisition remains beyond childhood. and that subsequent languages are learned by means which are more akin to how older learners acquire other dominants of knowledge, such as mathematics or history. So, because it is impossible for us to observe mental capacity for language learning directly, the different beliefs are based largely on theoretical assumptions that are tested by indirect methods, which individuals who come from different disciplinary perspectives may not agree on. So, for example, many linguists rely on learners' ability to judge which L2 utterances are not possible. Okay, so there's like the example that we mentioned a while back. Apple give me an aspect of children's first language competence which is attributed to innate capacity. Now, how about the intermediate states? Both L1 and L2 learners go through intermediate states as they progress from their initial to their final state linguistic systems. There's similarity in that the development of both L1 and L2 is largely systematic, including predictable sequencing of many phenomena within each and some similarity of sequencing across languages. And in the fact that L1 and L2 learning both play a creative role in their own language development and do not merely mimic what they have heard or been taught. So we have processes. So first one, we have to note that development is spontaneous and largely unconscious process in first language child grammar, while, where it is closely correlated with cognitive maturation. In contrast, the development of learner language or intra-language for second language learners occur at age when cognitive maturity cannot be considered a significant factor. Second language learners have already reached a level of maturity where they can understand and produce complex utterances in their L1, and level of maturity is not language specific. Processes other than maturation must be involved to explain development in second language acquisition. Now we will talk about positive transfer and negative transfer. Positive transfer happens when an L1 structure or rule is used in second language utterance, and that use is appropriate or correct in the second language. And negative transfer or interference when a first language structure or rule is used in second language utterances, and that use is inappropriate and considered an error. Cross-linguistic influence occurs in all levels of IO: vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, and all other aspects of language structure and use. Supressitive transfer facilitates second language learning because an L1 structure or rule that also works for L2 means that a new one doesn't have to be learned. For example, a word that has essentially the same form and meaning in both languages can transfer appropriately from L1 to L2. For example, the word exterior, outside, in a word in both Spanish and English pronounced differently, but with the same spelling and meaning. Negative transfer of L1 features can often be inferred from forms in the second language which are unlikely any that are likely to be produced by a native speaker of the second language, or are integration of elements which could not occur in monolingual speech. Inappropriate transfer of L1 pronunciation to L2 is detectable as a foreign accent in a non-native speaker's production. It is probably the most common and most easily recognized aspect of L1 influence. It is also necessary to consider the following conditions: the feedback, including correction of the second language learner's errors, that's still under intermediate states. Aptitude, including memory capacity and analytic ability, motivation or need and desire to learn, and instruction or explicit teaching in school settings. So the final state is the outcome of L1 or L2 learning. The final state of L1 development by definition is native linguistic competence. So after all the processes that a person has to go through, then the final state is already the result of or the outcome of the first language and the second language learning. The final state of second language development, again by commonly held definition, can never be totally native linguistic competence, and the level of proficiency which learners reach is highly variable. Some learners reach at least near native or native like competence. Actually, I've mentioned a while back about the native likeness. Competence in second language along with native competence in first language, but many cease at some point to make further progress toward the learning target in response to L2 input, resulting in final state, which still includes instances of L1 interference or creative structures different from any of that would be produced by a native speaker of the L2. In the next videos, we will be talking about theories of second language acquisition and other things that are needed to be discussed in order for us to understand how second language acquisition takes place. Thank you and God bless you.